Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Maureen Fox, and I am currently an ESOL consultant here at the Maine Department of Education, working with April Perkins and Robin Fleck as well. And today we are going to take a look at the guidance manual that has been in development over the last couple of years, identifying and serving students who are English learners with disabilities, policy and resource guide. Keep in mind that it is still in draft stage, and hoping to have this finalized coming very soon. So I will present the slides. I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions at the end. So I'll go through the slides. If you have questions or have resources that you would like to share or any contributions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to those questions, as many as we can at the end. And we'll collect those questions as well. So even if we don't get them, we don't have time to answer them, please just share your questions in the chat. And just as a reminder to remain muted when not speaking, so we don't have the background noise. So thanks for that. Okay, so in the development and process stage of the manual, I'm going to talk about that a little bit and give you a little background information. The U.S. Department of Education, Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, recommended that states create a guidance to districts for ELs with disabilities. At the time of the National Center on Educational Outcomes report in 2019, there were only 9 states with such guidance manuals and 2 in development. So it was around this time too, I think, and April can jump in, that Maine started the process of developing the manual. And April Perkins has been the primary force behind the effort to provide a guidance manual to educators of ELs with disabilities. And then Robin Fleck, she has done extensive research and collected best practices currently in the field, reviewing manuals from other states. And in that review, it was found that Virginia's manual aligned really well to our state's needs. Permission was given to us to use their framework, and so our manual has been developed using that framework that Virginia has also used. The various stakeholders have been identified, so this part of the process still needs to be identified. Some of those stakeholder groups are special education team, child development services, parent groups, community groups, school psychologists, to name some of them. So right now the document is being shared with special services. We're forming a collaborative team to look at this together. Stakeholders have been identified, will be shared with them. The legal review will be done, and then hopefully it'll be ready for implementation in the next school year. We'll have to see, given the pandemic and people's schedules, it's taken longer than expected. So hopefully we can stay on course. So in the table of contents, you'll see the section headings, and these are the topics that are covered in the guidance manual. We'll take a look at each of these topics a little more closely, and then again, save time for your questions. In the section where it's commonly asked questions and answers, that's where I'd like to collect more of your questions, whether we get to them today or not. We'll have them available to review for that section of inclusion if they're not already there. So then in the introduction, there are 4 key themes. And these themes are really embedded throughout the manual. And they really are all dependent on collaboration. So they are the equitable education for ELs with disabilities, accurate and appropriate identification of ELs with disabilities using multiple measures, providing culturally and linguistically responsive dual services, and collaboration among educators. So special educators, ESOL teachers, general ed teachers, administrators, specialists, parents, really requiring collaboration among all partners. I think these themes were also consistent with what Decca had talked about this morning, as well as Dr. Christensen. In the pre-referral procedure step, these 4 steps are then presented in more detail in the manual. But before a student is referred for special education evaluation, there are these pre-referral steps in the process. And these 4 steps, they're really similar to the district's multi-tiered systems of support or your response to intervention systems that are out. And then again, they're outlined in the manual. So in each case, along these all 4 steps, the student receives culturally and linguistically appropriate instruction to meet their English language proficiency standards as well as their content standards.
In terms of professional development, it's kind of like what national boards do, where you're
okay, I wasn't sure what that was. Okay, so they assume that those school-based supports are available. And in the next slide, we'll take a look at more detail in terms of these steps. So teacher intervention, requesting school assistance, then the interventions are decided upon, and then the team decides whether or not a disability might exist and whether or not to go further with the referral. So I know this is a little bit small, but I'll just talk through it a little bit. So with those 4 steps, then you have steps 1 and 2. Again, very much like your multi-tiered systems of support, where the student is receiving instruction and then necessary interventions in the general education setting. Again, assuming that the instruction is culturally and linguistically relevant, responsive to that student. So then in step 2, if the teacher needs to request some assistance from the school team, that's the point at which the team gets together and a lot of additional data is collected. And that's from a multiple of different sources: written records, observations, from family members and interviews, instruction, specific tasks. I think Dr. Christensen was talking about that. In order to understand the student better, we really need to give them the opportunity to see how they perform on certain tasks. So all of this is happening in those first 2 steps. I'll mention too that it's also determined what language and languages the student speaks and what proficiency level they may have in each of their languages. So then in step 3 is when that information is then reviewed. And it's also considered what, and the social cultural factors are also considered that may be contributing to the student not making the expected progress. So based on that information, interventions are determined and monitored over a period of time. And then if it's decided that the student is suspected to have a disability, they might refer to special education, or they might continue with different interventions and then decide at that following point. So all of these steps, again, are kind of laid out in the manual with some information on how to proceed through those steps. So if it is decided that a referral for an evaluation will go forward, then you're into the referral process. And this is another one of our sections. So the team may decide to move forward and make that referral. The process here is the same for all students. What's different for English learners, referred to as special education, is the essential background information regarding their language, their culture, prior educational experience, especially if they're new to the United States. So the team will need this data to rule out whether lack of English, appropriate instruction, cultural or educational background, low socioeconomic status are primary factors in the lack of the student's progress. So given that information and then moving forward, the team will decide whether or not based on the evaluations, the student is eligible. That is really dependent on a very comprehensive evaluation. The fact that there are no standardized tools besides some in Spanish. So not having the standardized tools that are normed for English language learners provides a challenge for teams to accurately determine whether the student has a disability or not. The data and background information gathered during the pre-referral steps is critical to the referral team in deciding what evaluations are needed, how they will be administered, as well as how the results will be interpreted. So this is from the manual, this quote here. I'll just read this. ELs cannot be denied access to special education and related services due to the lack of appropriate test instruments and procedures. Therefore, a continued and expanded commitment to exploring interventions and dynamic evaluation strategies is essential. So we know that having one data point or using one standardized assessment tool is not sufficient. And again, because they're not normed on students, that the results are not truly valid or reliable. So multifaceted approach to comprehensive evaluations in all areas related to the suspected disability need to take place. And then that information is gathered from a variety of sources to develop the complete picture of the student's current function and needs, and test assessments and other components are selected and administered to neither be culturally, linguistically, nor racially discriminatory. So following the comprehensive evaluation, if the student is determined to be eligible for special education services, then it's up to the team to develop the IEP. The ESOL teacher or representative with expertise in the second language acquisition process is a member of the IEP team for all English learner students. And Dr. Christensen reinforced this morning as well. It's the ESOL teacher who develops that expertise in being able to differentiate between language learning and a possible learning disability. So their involvement is critical through every step of the pre-referral, referral, and IEP process to determine whether a student is eligible for special education services with a disability. They also bring information about the student's proficiency in English and as well as their home and primary languages. Now, this information is included in the present level of academic achievement and functional performance, and it's then considered when determining goals, accommodations, and modifications and other services that would be included in the IEP. So again, it's critical for the ESOL teacher, somebody with that language acquisition expertise, to be participating in the team at all steps of the process. And then another one of the topics is instructional considerations. So English learners with disabilities are entitled to the same ESOL programming as ELs without a disability. And while providing dual services to ELs with disabilities can be very challenging, it is up to the IEP team, along with the Language Acquisition Committee, to decide how best to provide both required services given the individual student's needs. A balance and an integration of English language development and disability related services is really required. So the amount of time and the setting for the instruction and services will depend on the significance of the disability and the level of the student's language proficiency. So Dr. Christensen spoke to this morning, if you were available for that. And she presented the framework that is in the TELA resources, where depending on the student's level of disability and their proficiency is how you will determine what services that they'll need. And keeping in mind too that language learning is very fluid, and there may need to be changes to their instruction and the setting in which those services are provided on a regular basis. On this slide are the recommendations from the state as to the periods of instruction for ESOL instruction. And again, based on their English language proficiency. So this doesn't change for our students with a disability. It just has to be figured out how to best meet their needs. So you want to, and on the right here are just some considerations for instructions, which again, this is just kind of an overview of the information that is in the manual, but then keeping in mind that the students' home language, English levels, their culture, their families, their funds of knowledge, their interests, all of that information will help to design the curriculum that is integrated and best meets the students' needs. And again, considering the least restrictive environment, so that student is able to be included in other settings and have English-speaking role models throughout their day. So one of the topics is communication with parents. And some of the key things that we know are that school district must engage in meaningful communication in a language that parents and guardians can understand. Then school districts need to provide interpreters and translators. And these interpreters are really the link between the school, the family, and the student. And parents need to be informed of their rights. So it's really important to be working as a team to resolve any differences that might come up, as well as to support the student in their education. And so while this is true in all cases of communicating with parents, it requires additional training of interpreters for special education meetings. Parents and guardians, they provide critical information that's really necessary for the IEP team to determine whether a disability exists. And in order to build lasting partnerships with parents, educators must build those relationships through reciprocal intercultural communication. We want those partnerships to be long-lasting. And I know that Decca talked about this morning as well in her remarks. Building those welcoming parents and building that partnership in order to support their students. So in the guidance manual, there are many resources, and I've just listed some of the key resources here. The English Toolkit from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of English Language Acquisition, is a primary resource for this work. The Dear Colleague letter has very good information. It's embedded within the letter itself. There's a section on students with special education needs. And then the other guidance manuals from other states. So the National Center on Educational Outcomes that I mentioned in the introduction, they published a report in 2019 that that reviewed some of the guidance manuals and provides ideas and lessons from the field, which is a great resource as well. Included in the many other resources that we have are 4 case studies that we hope will be helpful to you as they outline the steps, the 4 steps in the pre-referral process, and other supports that a student would need before referral is made for special education. So hoping that those resources, and as I said, there are many more, are helpful to you in your planning for students with disabilities. Just looking at. There's a section of commonly asked questions and answers, and the questions fall under these following categories here. So we looked at English learners, the identification process, then serving English learners with a disability, assessing English learners with a disability, and the language and acquisition and development. I am going to finish the slides, I think, so that I can close my screen and see the chat. And that's when, if you haven't already added to the chat some questions, look at these categories and then be thinking about what questions you hope might be covered in the manual and that you would like to see in there. Okay, so for next steps, just to let you know that, again, I mentioned the various stakeholder groups and that we're in the process of sharing the document with those groups, including special education department, so that the document can be reviewed, comments can be provided, and then we can make some final edits to that. So we get the final stamp of approval from the Maine Department of Education and hoping to roll out to schools in the next school year. Again, depending on everybody's schedule and the time that they have available for this right now, given the pandemic and the extra workload that people have because of that. So I am available for any questions that you might have or any comments. You can contact me at maine.gov. Thank you very much for participating today. It's not quite over. We'll go to the questions together. But I'd like to remind you to fill out the evaluation at the end. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There we are, back, and take some questions. And hopefully you have some time to add to the chat some of the questions that you'd like to see in the manual.
Maureen, there are a few questions that have been placed in the chat, which I'm happy to read for you.
Okay.
There was a question that Robin has already addressed, but in case you wanted to add to this, it was, what is your experience with the BVAT as a tool to determine language growth in English versus another language? And maybe in response to that question, you could also share with anyone who's here who might not know what the BVAT is and let them know a little bit about it if you're willing.
Sure. Okay, so the BVAT is the Bilingual Verbal Ability Test, and it is the word section of the Woodcock-Johnson. So the word analysis and synonyms, antonyms, word analogies, and it's translated in about 15 different languages, but not in Somali, and it is in Arabic, but it is very kind of formal Arabic. It is a bit outdated or a lot outdated, depending, and it is really so then very much based on academic vocabulary. So when you think about students' background, cultural background, school experience, it may not be that relevant in terms of the questions. So there is some bias there in the test. What I have found that it can be helpful, and it's very helpful in terms of giving the student an opportunity to use their language. You're working with an interpreter of course, so you're administering in English and with an interpreter in that other language, unless you speak the language yourself. And so you're able to observe the student using that language. So I have found in my observational notes that being more helpful than the actual score that you get. I caution those of you who use it in terms of interpreting the score, because it may not really provide that much information. It assumes what you know. You ask the English questions, and then it assumes you know that in your other languages as well. You don't actually ask all the questions and get a response in the home or primary language. It's all we have in terms of a standardized norm tool, but it's very limited.
Thank you, Maureen. The next question is
April, can I
oh,
just
yeah,
interrupt?
please go ahead.
Well, the question was asking if it was useful as a tool in determining language growth in English.
Oh,
And to the best of my knowledge, it wasn't designed to monitor growth in English. And so I just want to be sure that we give, I think it was Laura, the benefit of your wisdom around that as well.
right. Yes. Yeah, thank you, Robin. I mean, it is used or can be used to identify English language learners. It has been used as a tool to identify English language learners. It has also been used to identify students for gifted and talented programs. I've had the experience of testing, I think maybe there were 2 students, but one really stands out to me. And it really did work very well because this student had prior education and a very, very good academic background in his language. So what it does, so it demonstrated the English vocabulary, and then it gives you a gain score, and that gain score was quite high. It was one of the highest scores I've ever received from given the BVAT. But again, one data piece, so it was it was helpful as an additional data point.
All right, the next question is regarding the manual. Are adult English language learners included?
Adult meaning, special education goes to age 22 now. It's been extended to age 22. So in terms of a high school setting, it's inclusive of all students through those grades and age range, but it doesn't address adults outside of that public school setting.
Next, it sounds like our EL and SPED departments should meet to discuss or perhaps even develop a PLC between these 2 departments. Do you have other ideas for this communication and processing?
Mm-hmm. Is that are you talking about in your school for your teams to meet in your school?
I am, and it can be bigger than that, but as a beginning process.
Yes, yeah, so absolutely. And in the report of the different manuals from the states, that's one of the recommendations is the professional development that really needs to follow a manual like this. I mean, I think we can collect all best practices and the information, but unless we really have a plan to implement, and yes, that would be with special education. And it's in a lot of ways, special education really leading this, and then us working together, because they have information we need as ESOL teachers, and ESOL teachers have information that they need. And the support of the administrators to really allow the time for that collaboration to happen.
Right, thank you.
Yes.
All right, next is there a specific screener tool we can use for an identified student with a cognitive or speech language disability?
Well, Dr. Christensen spoke to that this morning. They're in the process of developing a screener. for students with significant cognitive disabilities. We don't have it available to us yet. I mean, that was for identifying English language learners. And I mean, I've seen one from Alberta, Canada, but we don't have one here as far as I know outside of the telework that's being done. There are some recommendations, however, in terms of gathering that information and giving the student an opportunity to, given certain tasks to perform what they know and what they know in other languages, but that takes time. The thing with the screener too is that's kind of a quick look, and a quick look is not enough when we're trying to understand the complexities of students with significant cognitive disabilities.
That was kind of my question, is if there's something we can use in the interim while we're waiting. Is there anything?
Mm-hmm. And so let me just ask again to be clear. So this is for identifying, is it identifying as students with significant cognitive disabilities as an L?
Yes. So in other words, a student who's already been identified or is in the process of being identified for cognitive disability. We actually had a student come into our district like this who came to us with cognitive disability, but also had a previous background of multicultural language exposure, was adopted. So with that in mind, as the L teacher, it's not very easy to use WIDA screener because it's not geared for someone with a cognitive disability.
Okay. So the way that we've addressed that in the manual is that, and so I attempt to use the screener, but also interviewing the parents and getting information from them.
Right.
That's really your primary source. And based on that information, you'll know how to proceed even with attempting the WIDA screener. And also understanding what accommodations they might need in terms of just orienting them to the testing situation and using an interpreter to help them to feel comfortable and to understand what's going on. And then I think as much time as can be allowed before you need to complete that identification process, whether it's it's 2 weeks, to let them settle into their classroom, see how they are with their teachers, and gather information that way. So use as much time as you can to get to know the student before you actually give the screener, and you'll have a better idea of how to pursue that.
Okay, thank you.
The next question is any advice you might offer for learners. Oops, my chat just got covered up by email notifications. For learners who may be moving to adult ed to complete their education, but did not have formal IEPs while they were English learners in high school.
I think, well, so this is just comes to mind. I really think that sharing with students what kind of learner they are, getting that information from the student and helping them understand the type of learner that they are and the type of strategies that they need so that they can really advocate for themselves in adult education. And I know you can be identified with a disability as an adult, but it would really be up to that individual to be able to advocate for themselves and pursue that path. But I think teaching them how to talk with teachers, and I haven't met an adult educator who wouldn't be receptive to that, is really important. That they need to get to know themselves as a learner and be able to advocate for themselves. And time spent really helping a student do that would be time well spent.
All right, and the last question in the chat for now is, does the main DOE have a list of interpreters who have received additional training in special education? And I'm happy to answer that and say that, no, we don't have such a list. I'm afraid that the number of interpreters who would land on that list would be fairly small statewide, but it's certainly something we can try to compile. That said, I'm not sure what the benchmark would be that we would look for in order to put someone on that list, because there isn't necessarily a formal training or any kind of certification or licensure that we could look to say, yes, this person is qualified. So that's where it gets a little complicated is a person, any interpreter, any bilingual person truly can say, I'm an interpreter. And they could say, yes, I have experience and training in the language of special education, but there wouldn't be a way for us to verify or to be assured of the level of qualification that they have in speaking about special education. So it's a bit complex.
Mhm. I know in Portland that some of our interpreters have taken a course. I don't know what the course was, but they have done some additional training on their own. And we might be able to find out from them what course that they took.
Yeah, if you could share that with me, Maureen, that'd be great. I know there are general education field related courses that an interpreter might take, and I would assume that there's a special education component to that, but I don't know the depth and breadth of what training they receive there.
Mhm. And in the meantime, I think before, again, time is so precious and not always available, is to be able to meet with parents before an IEP meeting and along with the interpreter in order to prepare them for the meeting, as well as having an agenda where you're starting by introducing the interpreter and the intent of the meeting. So you can build in some of that needed extra work into the meeting itself if the person who's running the meeting. That takes a little practice and training as well.
And one other thing is if you're looking for a resource to help you, if you are working with an interpreter prior to an IEP meeting, for example, the Massachusetts Department of Education has published some wonderful glossaries that use vocabulary related to IEPs. So if you wanted to provide those glossaries to the interpreter and to the families in advance, then it would give you some common vocabulary to work with that everyone would be using in the same way. And then Jen, it looked like you wanted to say something, so I will let you do that.
Oh, I was just I put it in the chat, but I was thinking, Maureen, that it would be great if the DOE, we could partner and figure out how to work with some of the interpreters in Portland who have been part of so many IEP meetings, not necessarily to talk about the expertise of doing that work, but to just talk about the observations they have about the cultural issues that come up, not just the linguistic issues, but the cultural issues that come up in that very unique setting of an IEP meeting, because I think what you were saying is so important, but it would be great to, some of them have developed incredible expertise just around sort of the cultural aspects that I know has really helped.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's a great suggestion, Jen. And that cultural piece where we have parent community specialists in Portland, where they really do some of the brokering for us in helping the families understand U.S. school system and special education. And the other thing I might add to that too is just as a thought in working with families is that it really takes time to build that relationship, as you know. And as you're meeting students, as soon as you think you are concerned in any way, it's involving the parents and starting that relationship and that back and forth so that you can build that partnership over time. If it does end up in a referral, you'll have all that background information and partnership that you need to make some very, very serious and difficult decisions. And you want to make sure that that parents or guardians aren't surprised, that students aren't surprised, and that it's a very transparent process and everybody is in agreement one way or another.
It looks like someone has their hand up. if you want to go ahead and unmute and share your question.
Hello, guys. Hello, Maureen. We
Hi,
missed you.
Hannah.
Um, the one major thing that keep coming back lately is that when we hire an interpreter, because we have so many languages at PPS, is that the need for training the edtechs that we hire. Any job, any organization, any place that you go to a new job, people get trained. Can the main Department of Education be, encouraging that for districts to hire and train their staff?
April?
I regret that I was multitasking. Please forgive me. I was answering another private message in the chat, and I think I missed the gist of your question. Would you mind reiterating it for me? And again, I apologize.
The main thing is that any place that people start a new job, they get trained anywhere, any place. So we need the people who are hired because of the need of many languages. Can we have them? Oh, Esther's here. Hi. Can we have them trained?
Through the Department of Education?
Yes. Or encourage the, districts to train them.
Well, I think what the department has done thus far is communicate with districts the importance of having interpreters and translators who have professional qualification and are trained and well prepared to serve that role, because that's a civil rights responsibility of the district. So it wouldn't be the department who would provide that training, but it would be the district who would ensure that anyone they hire has that training. So it would be in the best interest of a district, if they have an interpreter that they'd like to work with, to make sure that that interpreter has sufficient training, but that wouldn't be something that the department would provide.
And I'll add that one of the things that I'd been involved in Portland with our special ed director at the time was providing training to our interpreters. And she would do an overview of special ed law and rights for parents. So that was really helpful. So my suggestion would be to team with your special ed folks in your district and host something where you're providing that overview and that information. And then, as Jen Lund had said, it's really the experience, as you know too, Hannah, it's really kind of living through some IEP meetings.
Yeah.
It's really how you develop those skills, right? I can see some other thumbs up, people with experience in that. So I know that we're really kind of at the end of our time here. I'm not sure, did we get to all of our questions? I
think we hit all of them except for one, and I'm not sure of the pronunciation of your name, but the question was, are there any specific recommendations for linguistically and culturally responsive approaches to special ed students with 504 plans for anxiety disorders? So I don't know that you can answer that in this last 30 seconds that we have, but if you want to try, or you could coordinate over email. If you'd like to email Maureen, I'm sure she would be happy to give you some thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I would just like to end with, I mean, I couldn't answer that question right now, but again, thinking back to Dr. Christensen's framework, and depending on the significance of the disability and then the level of the language proficiency, that's where we're going to really design that instruction and the supports that the student needs. So if there's trauma in there too, it really needs to be very individualized. And you need to kind of individualize the resources that you have for that particular student. Thus, the complexity and the challenge of this work. And if you were there to see her image, it's triple the work or quadruple the work. That's why we need to collaborate. That's why we need a team approach and to be working with our special educators among our other specialists and educators and administrators to meet the needs of all students, but particularly this very challenging, complex group of English learners with disabilities. So
All right.
thank you all for attending today. And as April said, if you have any questions, please follow up with me, and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
All right, thanks everyone. Enjoy your last session of the day and have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.